One might have expected that the American Republic, having endured McCarthy's inquisitions and Nixon's enemies lists, would have developed immunity against the virus of state-sanctioned censorship. Yet here we stand, watching the unsettling spectacle of a federal bureaucrat wielding regulatory power to silence a late-night comedian, while corporate allies bow obediently before the altar of political intimidation. The suspension of Jimmy Kimmel exposes not only the fragility of America's supposed commitment to free expression, but also the willing complicity of those entrusted to safeguard it. Let us be precise about what happened. A comedian made remarks, perhaps intemperate, certainly partisan, about a political assassination before the facts had fully emerged. For this offense against the sensitivities of the MAGA faithful, he became the target of a coordinated silencing campaign that would make any authoritarian proud. The chairman of the FCC, Brendan Carr, the man once seen as the embodiment of regulatory restraint, saw fit to threaten broadcasting licenses with all the tact of a protection racketeer. We can do this the easy way, or the hard way. One searches in vain for any constitutional authority granting federal bureaucrats the power to dictate the limits of political satire. What followed was not just shocking but disgraceful. The corporate edifice crumbled with such speed before this thuggish display that it would be comical if it weren't so contemptible. Disney, that great vendor of fairy tales, revealed that its own corporate courage was itself a fantasy, evaporating at the first whiff of regulatory displeasure. Nexstar and Sinclair, self-proclaimed paragons of local broadcasting, discovered that their principles were as negotiable as their advertising rates. Within hours of Carr's threats, Kimmel was yanked off the air, suspended indefinitely, that wonderfully Orwellian phrase that manages to sound both temporary and eternal. And what was Kimmel's great crime? He had the audacity to suggest that those who rushed to exploit Charlie Kirk's death for political advantage were engaged in something less than noble. He used the phrase MAGA gang, hardly revolutionary language, and unless one truly believes that political movements should be immune from mockery. The irony, of course, is that Kirk himself built a career out of provocative rhetoric and gleefully puncturing liberal pieties. One suspects he would have found the pearl clutching over Kimmel's monologue rather amusing had he lived to see it. The most nauseating aspect of this affair lies in the sanctimonious posturing of those who engineered it. These are the very same voices who rail against so-called cancel culture when they're favored provocateurs face conséquence, who drape themselves in the First Amendment to defend even the most grotesque expressions of hatred, who insist that the marketplace of ideas should decide truth. Yet when confronted with speech they dislike, they instantly reach for the levers of state power. The hypocrisy is so pure, so crystalline, that one almost admires its shamelessness. But the precedent being set here is deadly serious. A government official can now credibly threaten media, companies with regulatory retaliation if their talent utters opinions deemed insufficiently reverent toward political martyrs. The chilling effect stretches far beyond Kimmel's silencing. Every comedian, every commentator, every journalist must now calculate whether their words might provoke the displeasure of those who hold the power to revoke broadcasting licenses. The self-censorship that follows is far more corrosive than overt suppression, producing a culture of timidity disguised as responsibility. The corporate media's surrender deserves special condemnation. These institutions, which profit handsomely from the protections of the First Amendment, abandoned their principles at the first sign of pressure. ABC's suspension of Kimmel was not simply cowardice, it was a betrayal of the very foundation upon which their industry rests. They showed that their loyalty to free expression extends only as far as their quarterly earnings. When Sinclair and Nexstar refused to air Kimmel's program even after his return, they revealed themselves to be willing accomplices in an act of political censorship that would shame any legitimate news organization. The invocation of sensitivity and respect in the wake of Kirk's death is particularly galling. Since when has American political discourse in a blood sport built on character assassination and rhetorical violence ever concerned itself with such niceties? The same movement that revels in owning the libs and delighting in its opponent's tears suddenly discovered the virtues of civility when one of its own fell. This selective outrage is not merely hypocritical, it is a tactical weapon, deployed to silence opposition under the guise of decorum. Kimmel's return, with critics deriding his remarks as crocodile tears, became a performance piece in the kabuki theater of modern discourse. He was forced to appear contrite without apologizing, humbled without yielding, defiant yet restrained, threading the impossible line between submission and resistance. That his return monologue became his most watched episode, despite being blocked in a quarter of American households, speaks volumes about the public's hunger for voices willing to resist this new orthodoxy. What unfolded here was not simply an attack on one comedian. It was an assault on the very principle that sustains democratic discourse. The right to speak uncomfortable truths, to challenge prevailing narratives, to mock the powerful without fear of state retaliation. That this censorship was enacted through corporate intermediaries rather than direct government action makes it no less dangerous, and indeed it may be more so, for it cloaks state power in the appearance of private choice. The Kimmel Purge, as history may call it, marks a dangerous inflection point in American public life. Either we recognize this moment for what it is, a precedent that threatens the foundations of free expression, or we drift toward a future where comedians require government approval for their monologues, where corporate boards draw the boundaries of political satire, and where regulatory threats hover over every act of speech. That this even needs to be said, that it is not obvious to all, suggests the battle may already be half lost. Those who engineered Kimmel's suspension may believe they have won a victory. In truth, they have only unmasked the authoritarian instincts that lurk behind their rhetoric of liberty. They have shown that their devotion to free speech extends only to those who bow before their ideological altars, and they have demonstrated that when given the chance, they will not hesitate to wield state power to silence dissent. The question now is whether the American people will recognize this as the test. It is a test of our collective commitment to the principles we claim to cherish. The alternative is far darker, a future where silence reigns, because fear has already done the work of censorship.